everybody, Jay Lieberman. I think I've met most of you before. Small class, should be really quick and simple. So I wanted just to kind of teach, it's a real quick kind of 20-30 minute, and then if you have any questions at any time, just let me know. But really it's just kind of commercial leases, just a real thing on why it's so much fun. And I wanted to start off kind of into three pieces here. One is kind of going over the different property types, because people get confused about what commercial is and what it isn't, and what the crossover is. And then the second piece of this is going over commercial lease types, office, retail, multifamily and stuff, so you can identify some of that. And then the third component of this is I just wanted to kind of run you guys through a real quick due diligence analysis of you found a multifamily property and how do you analyze it? You know, instead of just being a marriage counselor putting two people together, how do you actually analyze the property real quick? Even a back of the napkin, so you can talk to your client, even if you don't know anything about commercial, you could say, you know, based upon this, I think it's probably worth about that. So that's the whole idea of this, is just to kind of teach you a little bit about it so that you can speak to your clients a little bit about it, know a little bit of keywords to throw out, and then either participate or refer the work out, maybe hopefully to me or somebody else, okay? So there's many different property types, but they really get categorized into kind of the following. There's multifamily residential, which for our purposes is over 4 units. 4 units or less is still kind of covered by the residential component. All disclosures and everything remain the same. Anything over 4 units is considered, quote, commercial, and that's multifamily residential, small apartment buildings, things like that. There's industrial buildings, which you can see, I threw a few pictures up here, but you can see industrial kind of ranges from all the way to dirty, hardcore manufacturing, all the way up to kind of flex office space you see out in Westlake, where they have storefronts with offices and warehouse in the back. There's a range of that. So anyway, so we have industrial properties, like I spoke about, and I mentioned flex office industrial, which again is a lot of the stuff you see out in Thousand Oaks and Westlake. It's the kind of office front, warehouse in the back kind of stuff. It's much more of a cleaner type use. Then there's general and medical office buildings you see all around here, going all the way from the, you know, kind of garden style walk-up, which are kind of the Agora mom and pop type little buildings, 2-story things you see all over that you probably go to your dentist in most of the time. Then there's the multi-floor office towers that are, you know, multiple floors. Retail shopping centers, obviously. Then there's various categories of retail shopping centers, and this is where I've spent most of my life because it's the most fun. Some of this stuff becomes a bit mundane and boring. It's work nevertheless, but the retail shopping centers are a little bit more fun in the sense that there's a lot of categories. It ranges from the kind of small 2-3 tenant type little retail building all the way to the Target Center across the street, to the Oaks Mall and other super regional shopping centers. So generally speaking, just for our purposes, is that small strip centers, which are typically under 30,000 square feet, are your travel agent, your insurance office, things like that. It might have a 7-Eleven in it and things that are not a lot of credit, much more boutique-y kind of neighborhood. Then there's the neighborhood centers, which typically now balloon up to maybe about 125 square feet and almost always included a grocer. Be it it's your typical kind of grocery anchored, maybe drugstore in there as well, Vaughn's, Pavilions type center. And then there's the community center. These are just tag words that they have for them. These range can go from 125 all the way up to 400,000. A lot of times community centers include a drug, include a grocer, might include we'll start including uses like bookstores, sports stores, restaurants will start coming into it, and it's much more of a larger box type center where you start seeing that. Think of the Westlake Promenade, for instance, is kind of one of those. You see a lot of these out in suburbs typically where the land is cheap and you can build centers like this for large boxes. Then you start getting into regional malls, which start to become really kind of almost like, you know, let me back up a second. Community centers also start to include what they call kind of category killers, which are Home Depot, Lowe's, the Costco elements to them. They sometimes are components of those. When you get into the regional malls, you start seeing also big ballooned up box tenants, but you start to now bleed over into regional malls into kind of junior department stores. You might see a Nordstrom Rack and some other department stores like that, Burlington Coat Factory. Think of the Jan's Mall. I keep thinking because they're just a very simple kind of regional mall. And then you get into your super regional, which are the larger malls like the Oaks, Topanga, things like that. They're really your standard full department stores, sometimes accompanied with another category killer and things like that, okay? Beyond that, there's many, since, I've been doing this a long time, and probably, 10, 15 years ago, you've seen a lot of lifestyle centers go up, they call them, which now they've taken hybrids of all these centers, really mixed them up all into one. So you see something like the Target Center across the street. You would never see that before 10 to 15 years ago. It's a category killer type regional mall with entertainment, restaurant components to it, with a gym mixed in with it. So you're seeing lots of hybrids now, and a lot of these definitions are starting to fall out the window a little bit because those are becoming more popular for people to hang out, drive sales and things like that. Lifestyle centers and is another, you see almost like the Westlake Promenade. I'm picking pieces that are out here that you're familiar with, that have even a bookstore, could have nightclubs, movie theaters, things like that, and they start to become hybrid.
Who categorizes all of this? Every county and every city?
The International Conference of Shopping, the ICSC, which is the International Conference of Shopping Centers. Typically, that's the main Titanic entity in the country for shopping center agents. And they create these categories, but again, there are categories in the sense of knowing what they are and what you can develop, but they're starting to really merge together. The hard, fast categories are not as they used to be. They're getting a little blurred. And there's also the outlet malls, which are very popular, you've seen around, and those are now starting to pull in food users now in restaurants when they never did before. So it's about keeping the customer there. But I love retail, so I like spending a lot of time in retail. And then there's everything else. So you could think of, auto dealerships, auto repair, vet clinics, medical care, that kind of stuff is everything else. There's a million different uses. But these are generally kind of the bulk of the uses. Then we kind of get into the different lease types. Unlike residential, where it's just you're paying your rent, you do a year, you pay for your electric and gas, and that's the deal. Commercial leases are a bit more complicated than that. They really fall into three categories. You may have heard of them around before, but the main three categories are full service gross, modified gross, that's fancy, and triple net with the three N's. And triple net is another term which I'll go through right now, which essentially they go from tenant paying the least to the landlord for certain things to the most. Okay? So in a full service gross lease, they're very typical office property leases, and the way they work is a tenant in an office property typically pays for their rent, $2 a square foot, whatever it is, they're 1,000 square feet. It's $2,000 a month. Plus they pay for, and I'll make you guys a copy of this if you want afterwards, I'll email it to you. And they also pay a certain amount, potentially, of the landlord's operating expenses for the property. So if you get a client that comes to you and says, God, I need to move my offices, I need about 3,000 square feet, do you know what's available? Say, you know what, let me talk to my guys, I'll find out what's available, but do recognize that, in that kind of a deal, you're gonna be paying your rent, plus you might be paying a little percentage of the landlord's costs to operate that office building. And those costs are the insurance for the property taxes for his property, as well as they call them common area maintenance charges for the property, which are landscaping, janitorial, changing light bulbs, everything you could think of in this building, what the Terrys pay for this space. And typically the way full service gross works, again, is like I said with the retail centers, things begin to blur a little bit with this because there's a million different ways to skin these cats, but these are the main three categories. But what they do in full service gross leases is typically the first year you sign an office lease, let's say it's a 5-year lease that you put a client into an office space. Typically the first year is you're just paying your rent and you're not paying any sort of common area maintenance charges at all. And what happens is they have what's called an over base year charge in the lease, which means that after the first year, that year, let's say 2015 we put the tenant in. After the 2015 year, the expenses for that 2016 year are going to be compared to when they went in 15, and if there was any increase in the landlord's cost to operate that building, that tenant is going to pay their little share of what that increase is. And that's what's called over base year charges. The base year is the year that they went in, that all the other future years compare to. And if at any time there's an increase in expenses as compared to that base year when they went in, they're going to pay their little share of that increase.
Good question.
Yeah.
The prorated part is based also on a full house, or what if some of the tenants are not?
There's a lot of technicalities that go beyond kind of 101, what some of this is. But to answer your question though, because it is a good question, is that The percentage share that the tenant pays, meaning if they compare 16 to 15 and the property costs $10,000 more to operate that next year, if that tenant is 10% of the building, meaning square footage wise, if they're 10,000 square feet on a 100,000 square foot property, they're going to pay 10% of that $1,000 that next year. If your question is, what if the building is vacant except for this one tenant? In most leases, they have what's called, and this gets a little complicated, but they have what's called a 95% gross up, which means that regardless of the occupancy of the building, they're going to charge you the expenses as if it was 95% occupied. Because insurance always remains the same, taxes always remain the same, and it costs the same amount to continue to landscape and operate the property. That's why they do it. So
Okay,
that's typical.
So if the building is half vacant, it's the
Usually
landlord,
it doesn't matter. The tenant will usually pay as if the building is 100% occupied.
Okay.
Otherwise, the landlord's taking a huge hit. But that's generally kind of what full service gross and how that works. And that's typically for your office clients that are moving offices around. Okay? Any questions on office, any of that? No. The next one is called modified gross, which is very similar to full service gross in that it has a lot to do with office properties. And typically these are your smaller kind of mom and pop small buildings, not your 4 to 10 story buildings. They're usually the walk-ups, the kind of little agora buildings you go to the dentist in and things like that. A lot of the smaller buildings are called modified gross, and what that means is that the landlord pays for everything. You don't pay them your share like in the one above. You don't pay them any of that stuff. You just pay your rent, you pay your own utilities, and you clean your own unit, pay your own janitorial. And that's typically what modified gross is. Again, things blur in commercial, so there is hybrids of that where it might be combined with an over base year charge like we talked about above. They might have to pay something in the future a little bit, but in most cases, modified gross are the smaller tenants, the little lawyer who goes into an 800 square foot space in a small building over here in Agora, and he's going to pay his rent, his utilities, and janitorial. So that's generally kind of what modified gross is. And then most of the retail leases, when you get into the retail properties, are what's called triple net. And there's a couple different kinds of triple net. There's regular triple net, and then there's what sometimes you like to call absolute triple net. And these are really strictly for industrial and retail leases. The office leases are usually handled in that realm, usually. There's sometimes hybrids again. And retail and industrial handled here. And a triple net, what it usually means, it's a retailer. So, Pickup Sticks across the street. Pickup Sticks is going to pay, they're paying $4.50 a foot, I know, because I saw their lease one time. They're paying $4.50 a square foot, and they're paying their share of all the landlord's operating costs for the shopping center. There's no over base or charge or anything. It's day one, they're paying their share, which is, their share is defined as their footage over the whole footage of the center. Okay, that function. And they're paying also their own janitorial, their own utilities, their own waste management a lot of times for their trash, their own grease intercepting for retail tenants. I mean, you can go on and on and on. But they're also paying their proportionate share of all the costs for the landlord to operate that center. Sweeping, the lights, and you can imagine new centers are expensive. To give you just a range, for you can throw out to your clients, a regular retail shopping center that's been around for a long time, 65 to 75 cents a square foot a month. That's in addition to rent. That's typically covers all those charges. Over across the street right here, it's about $1.30. Newer project, more expensive to operate, taxes are higher. Westlake Promenade, about $1.85 to $2.25. The Oaks Mall and a couple other shopping centers, and it's over there. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's about $2.50 a square foot, just for maintenance a month. And it differs by center, but that's kind of the range between low and high. I live in the 85 to $1 range. That's usually where most of the world exists, unless you get into real specialty and malls that are very expensive. Now, some people, this right here is the basis for most of the litigation that goes on between landlords and tenants at retail centers. How many lawsuits I've been in regards to this as a landlord and as a tenant. It's intense in this realm, and what has happened in this realm is there's been a big movement on getting rid of the proportionate share concept, because every year the landlord has to show the tenant before the year what they're going to be paying every month, and then at the end of the year they have to reconcile it, provide it to the tenant. The tenant can get pissed off and angry and start auditing the books of the landlord, and it can go back and forth into complete pissing match for a long time. Sometimes it ends up in litigation and it gets nasty. A lot of landlords and tenants are starting to soak this up now and to start seeing a fixed triple net fee. No questions. It's $1 a foot a month, that's it. And there's no reconciling, there's nothing, that's it. And it goes up by some consumer price index, inflationary figure every year, and no one's questioning it. That's a movement that's going on right now, and it's gaining popularity.
Why wouldn't you, as a landlord, always want the absolute triple net for the retail rather than the triple net if you're going to cover the structure as well?
No, it's a great question, because most of the small retailers, because that's one of the components, largest differences between triple net and absolute is that the landlord in regular shopping centers over here will cover the roof and structure of the property and all the main components. In absolute triple net, they typically will not include anything. The landlord essentially gets his check and tenant covers everything. It's a coupon clipper. Most retailers in regular shopping centers won't stomach this, and that's what happened. They essentially won't go into the center knowing that they have to front the roof costs and things like that. And most of the time, and another reason why, is because most of the time in centers like that, like across the street, they have shared roof and structure. So it's a complete pain in the butt to figure out who's going to pay for what part of their roof. It's almost always a one contiguous structure. Absolute triple net is typically designated for your single tenant, single purpose bank parcel, a small out parcel drugstore, things like that that are separate and apart and parcelized, that there's one structure that the tenant occupies the whole thing.
So can you do both triple net? So let's say they built like an Olive Garden right in the middle of the parking lot right there. Can Olive Garden be an absolute? And
Absolutely.
complex be triple?
Absolutely, and there'll be hybrids of everything, and tenants will be different. Sometimes landlords don't like that. They like to control their roof and structure. And they could put the roof and structure costs into the expenses that everyone's going to pay their share of anyway. So most of the time, a landlord, it seems odd, but will actually want this a little more than this. These became kind of reserved for the the real kind of like guys that were coming out of exchanges and buying 10 grocery stores or buying 10 drugstores at a time kind of thing. They know they have a coupon, they're gonna get 6%, Rite Aid's gonna be paying them every month, this is it, and Rite Aid's gonna cover everything. But you will see hybrids between the two. And there's a million different pieces to all of this that can range. And I've seen it all, I've seen hybrids, but you gotta understand just the basic concepts of them. That full service and modified are really for office properties, triple net and absolute are really for retail and industrial properties, and that's where it goes. I didn't focus much on industrial because it's super easy. It's a box of tilt-up concrete and you lease it for X a foot, and the operating expenses are usually much cheaper than retail, you can imagine, because the services are much reduced. They're very, very simple. A lot of times industrial and flex office spaces, you'll see 35 to 45 cents a square foot in extra charges. No. Then I thought it would be interesting to roll through a transaction real quick about what's important if a client comes to you, and I picked multifamily just because it was simple and maybe the most likely. And multifamily meaning an apartment building over 4 units. Just a small caveat, like you probably know, but if you're over 4 units, all those disclosure requirements, and I hope Gay doesn't kill me for this, Gay, but a lot of the disclosure requirements go out the window, and it becomes a little bit like the Wild West. There's no TDS requirements and things like that. It's much more lower rep, lower warranties, and kind of much more as is, and a buyer doing their own due diligence and relying upon their own stuff.
So if you've got a single family dwelling and you've broken up the garage into 3 other living spaces, you don't need any.
You don't need it. That's a single thing. Under one roof, still a single house. So what becomes important when you're talking about multifamily over 4 units, which is technically called commercial now, is the due diligence on the property becomes a whole other component that you don't do when you sell somebody a single family house. You sell them a house, you tell them how good the market is, and you help them with inspections and wait for the check, and that's kind of it. This is a bit, some people go beyond that, but this is a whole different analysis. The client is going to start leaning on you a little bit more for information and help about the property, about the tenants, about not only the condition of the property, but what's going on in the market. Are the rents over market? Is there a lot of defaults of the tenants that are there? So I just wanted to run you through real quickly kind of the due diligence that are just the hot buttons that I look at when looking specifically at a multifamily property, which you can keep in the back of your mind when you talk to a client. I'm careful not to advise them on it and tell them this is that, I don't tell them that I'm going to go to the city and pull the reports and give them to you and advise them on any of that, because we're not engineers or anything. But these are the things that they will start leaning on you for, that you need to start helping them with. So they're going to start talking to you about tenant stability. So they're going to say, okay, I have a 10-unit apartment building that I put in front of a client, and he's really excited about it. You want to start looking into the tenant stability, which means that you look into their lease files with him, or you get them. You start looking through and find out how many times have they filed defaults against this tenant. What's their credit report look like if it's in there? Has this space gone in and out? Has there been tenant in there every other month, a new tenant? Is there default letters constantly in there about smoking outside, anything like that? That's where you find out about these two things, which essentially is the quality of the tenant and the tenant stability of the property. Also, you look at what the tenant turnover has been over the last 3 to 5 years. I asked the landlord, give me a rent roll for the last 5 years annually, so I could see how the tenants change over time. Is there a difference? I had somebody in it was in Pasadena where it was a small property. It was 5 units, I think, a small thing, but I looked at the rent roll 5 years before, and I noticed that they changed from essentially just regular people to all Russian for some reason. Every name was Rico's Pride in Pasadena. It was all Russian. And one of the owners was Russian, and he was moving all his buddies in. Well, it caused a tenant stability problem if you weren't paying rent, but it was cool because he took them to on a trip. And so you find out a lot of things about the property, but things that you can say to the client, I looked into the tenant files, and there might be some problems. That's all you probably should say, but that's where you're going to do some of your hunting. The goal of this is to find smoking guns for price grind, to be honest with you. I represent mostly buyers than I do sellers. Selling commercial property is a whole nother realm that I stay out of a little bit. I think the money is better in the tenant and buyer rep. And I could talk to you more about that, why, but you're going to start getting questions on, okay, I have a property that's 10 units. They're all one beds, they're all studios, they're all 3-bedroom units. I mean, you got to make sure that the property unit makeup matches the market. So if you're in a market that has a lot of apartment buildings that are a mix of 2 and 1 bedrooms, like you likely find in most apartments, if your project has all studios, you might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing. Depends on the market and demand. If there's a lot of single people that are looking for studios, you might be the only game in town. If it's not, and there's more families and there's 2 bedrooms that are there, then you're going to be vacant most of the time. So unit makeup is an important component also. I like a mix. If I have a 10-unit building, I'm going to be looking for maybe a couple studios, majority in the 1 bedroom, and about 2 to 3 2 bedrooms. Just that's the mix. You like to be in the middle. We talked about this. You just want to be, with the unit makeup with the market. And the way to verify this, by the way, is to team up with a commercial agent and go market searching. We pay a lot of money every month to be a member of all these things that you get all this, these databases and things. So that's how you verify that, just on what's on the market. And a lot of times I drive around with the client and I start calling on signs and looking at properties next to his. Another couple components is that you look at the vacancy rate versus the vacancy rate of your property. So if your property is historically 5% vacant over time, tenants are coming and going a little bit, then you look at the market, and if the market's 3, you might have a little bit of room in there, there's about 2% in there where maybe there's some value. If the market is like 12%, you're in the middle of Nowheresville, California, and your property has been 5% vacant, which is great, and the market's 15% vacant, you're going to have some challenges. Because the market is telling you that vacancy is really tough in this area. You just happen to be lucky, or providing something that they're not, which means maybe your rents are too cheap, or you're providing services that are expensive that the others are not. There's just something to be aware of. And this kind of goes into that, talking about what the market rental rates are also. You want to do a study on that to see if you're way high or way low. Probably the most important component of all the due diligence is that, because if you have units that are $800 a month and the market, simple market survey, right? It's like a comp search for housing. You do a market survey that says that that those type of units are leasing for $700. You're over market. If you have gold in yours with granite everywhere and the others are crap holes, maybe you're not so bad. Maybe there is, because that's so bad, that's why it's $700. But if you're sitting at $100 over market and you're kind of like kind, you have a problem. You're overpaying for the property.
How do you check the market vacancy rate? What do you have to subscribe to a service that does that?
I mean, you can go online and try to piecemeal a little bit and do some active calling all over the place. But we're with CoStar and LoopNet and stuff like that we pull, pulls that stuff up instantly. But you can get an idea, even from the MLS. You probably can get an idea, even from you might, because you might look at properties that are I've looked at it, that are like 4 units. You might even pull up a 5 or 6 unit building on the MLS that ends up in there. You can get an idea and scratch around a little bit. So that's the most important thing. So those are really kind of the hot buttons to kind of pay attention to on the due diligence side. And again, I'll give you a copy of this if you wanted to read it later. Then I thought it'd be interesting that once you've been in front of a client and you kind of help them maybe analyze a property real quick, because what they'll do is they'll hand you a client. They'll say, I sent this thing, and they'll email you off a sheet of a setup on a property they found. What do you think about it? You're the broker. And you say, well, I'm not a commercial agent, but let me do some research. You'll look at these things and you'll be able to tell them the hot buttons. I think it's overvalued. I think it's underoccupied. I think it's got a lot of deferred maintenance compared to the market, et cetera. At least you'll have an idea. So the next thing I thought it'd be fun as kind of the last piece of this presentation really is to make money, is to talk about how these things are underwritten. When I say underwritten, I mean how you can help your client value them real quickly on the back of a napkin, pretty much. The first things were just talking points with them to figure out if the property is even worth looking at. This is how you analyze a property. Specifically, all commercial property generally falls into this valuation method, but we're only going to talk about multifamily because it's a little easier at this point. Really, generally speaking, these are the terms you'll see all over the place. You take your gross rental income, which is all the rent of the property that you got for that year. These are all annual figures. You subtract the actual or some market vacancy percentage that you found in your due diligence that we just went over. So if the property is operating at a 5% vacancy typically, you're going to subtract 5% of the gross income right there just to give yourself a market loss figure. When you do that, that's called effective gross income. That's all, it's just given a different name. And then to figure out essentially what you're going to make on the property, you take the effective gross income, you subtract the operating expenses, and then you come up with a figure that's known throughout all commercial realms as NOI or net operating income. That's the big figure. And that's the figure where you base all your valuation methods on most of the time. Okay? Net operating income is the number you'll get when you take $100,000 of rental income minus some vacancy factors. That's $100,000. Say it costs you $50,000 to operate the property. So $50,000 result is your net operating income. And then, of course, that's before you have any of your debt service or any of your accounting write-offs or amortizations that you make. Okay? It's kind of your EBITDA for real estate analysis to a certain degree.
Do you normally put it at 40% for expenses? Or
Most of the time. Used to be a third, now I do 40%. Then it depends on, for multifamily specifically. For retail and other ones, it's much more simple because I'm gonna get the tax bill, insurance bill, and find out what it costs to operate. The multifamily is a little bit fluffy, but to get a real rough estimate, yeah, 40% is usually pretty safe.
What elements do you include into the operating
I'm gonna show you. So the operating expenses include, well, rent, obviously. And by the way, as rental income, also for some multifamilies, as you get a little larger, are going to start including things like storage, and don't discount this. Watch out for it because all of a sudden it's worth something. Sometimes tenants are paying storage rent. Sometimes the laundry income properties that are over 5. And you may say it's nothing, but all of a sudden $100 a month over the course of a year for a small little cent deal could be worth $20,000 in value to the property. So and I'll show you why. So let's talk about the operating expenses. These are just keys here that you're going to have to pay attention to and know a little bit about to know what's included in a multifamily deal. Property taxes, obviously, we know. I put appeal there because every year I like to look at possibly appealing the tax bill. Insurance, I look into insurance to see if it includes earthquake and flood insurance. Just a consideration. Some lenders require it, some don't. You may look at a property that has $100,000 in revenue. The owner's telling you this, and your client hands you a sheet. $100,000 in gross rent, $50,000 in expenses, which gives you a $50,000 net operating income. But after you look through his operating statements real quickly in there, you notice that the guy's insurance is $10,000 a year. Call it $20,000 a year. It'd be huge. But so the guy chose to take earthquake and flood because he just is nervous about an earthquake and a flood. You don't necessarily need it. You can cut that insurance in half. So all of a sudden you picked up $10,000 of net operating income just in your own underwriting yourself because you saw that he overinsured the property for his own personal reasons. So those are the things you want to see, because that $100,000 now is worth about $150,000 of value to the property. Just like that, if you can get rid of it. So if you could pick the property up based on a $50,000 net operating income and find $10,000 more here that are rolled back in, you're sitting really in the gold. Utilities in multifamily, typically you probably know, but landlords typically pay for the water, sewer, and usually the lights outside and whatnot. I put check for reasonableness because you want to make sure that they're paying the right utilities. And these are things you're not really going to have answers for, but you can at least come to someone like me or somebody else and say, God, the water looks high. Can you verify that for me? There's kind of a number. Most multifamily deals, you know, about $500-600 a year is water sewer for a typical unit, 2-bedroom unit. It's just kind of a roundabout figure that I see all the time. Trash, I know it's kind of meaningless, but once you get over 5-6 units, all of a sudden you start needing a dumpster, and the cost of trash, now you have one in lieu of paying it to the Department of Water and Power and your water bill or whatnot. Dumpsters can cost $150 to $200 a month. And so you got to be aware of that, because if you have to pay that when you didn't think you had to pay that, that $200 a month is $2,400 a year, which is probably about $30,000 in value. Now you're overpaying for the property by 30. So each one of these components you need to study so you realize if you're overpaying or not, or where you find value. You're gonna have a landscaper, general. When you're over 4 units, you're usually gonna be required to have fire extinguishers. These are nonsense expenses. I mean, they're $50 a year kind of expenses. Pest control you're gonna have, which is your typical pest control fee of $50 a month. You're going to have a management fee likely. It depends on how many units you have, but you probably heard different locations and municipalities have different requirements for managers and management fees associated with it. So if you have over 15 units, typically you're required to have an on-site manager managing the property. Depends on the area. But typically management fees for a regular building, just all tenant occupied, are 4 to 6% of the income collected. It's very standard. You know, you can operate it yourself, and all of a sudden that money's gone. You may find a lot of landlords have a management fee, an asset management fee, a friend fee. I mean, all kinds of stuff that's loaded in there where all of a sudden you turn around and it's like 10% of the income is going to their other entities because that's how they operate it. And the selling agent, the listing agent for the property may have not adjusted for that. You may still have the management fee at 10%. Well, I know I could do that for 4 or 5%. I just saved myself another 10 grand. That's another $150,000 in value of the property. So these are things just to watch eyes and smoking guns essentially for your benefit and burden depending on what you find. Repair and maintenance of the property. I always have a reserve in there. Part of the due diligence analysis that we went over in some slides before is looking at the files, just piecing through the files. There might be a lot of repairs, pipe replacements, roof replacements, things like that. At least you can get an idea what the repairs are for the property. Typically they range between $500 and $800 a month per year per unit. That's just kind of a typical range depending on age. If it's an older project, I'm going to reserve $800 a unit for repairs a year. You have some permits and license fees in here that come up when you're in rent control areas like LA and Burbank, for instance. And then you have general administrative like office expenses, postage, and all that other crap if you decide to put in. But those are generally kind of the expenses of a center. The last thing I wanted to go over was how do you value it now? So now that you have this net operating income, how do you come up with a value for the property and determine that what you found is right? There's 3 different approaches really. There's the cap rate approach, gross rent multiplier approach, and the price per foot. These are simple, so I'll go over these first. And these are primarily for multifamily because retail and stuff, they become a little less relevant. But a gross rent multiplier for multifamily essentially says how many times in the price I'm paying for the rent for that 1 year. So if the property is $100,000 and I have $10,000 of income every year out of that property, that's a 10 multiple. It's pretty simple math on that one. It's pretty much how long is it going to take me to make, is that income going to be to make the value back? Typical multifamily deals, you'll see now because it's hotter than a pistol, range from 10 to 15 times the income. So if you're making, if the property's pulling in $10,000 in effective gross income every year, you're going to be paying $100 to $150,000 for that.
How is that? I didn't get it.
10 times, 15 times that income. That's what you're going to pay.
Okay.
So that's just a gross rent multiplier. I don't like this. Most people don't. It's irrelevant. You could think of it as just esoteric kind of number that comes out of the ether that means nothing. It's a gut check more than anything else. So if I see something between 10 to 15%, I know I'm in the cards. If I see something that ends up being in the 23s or something like that, I know I'm in trouble. Price per foot is fairly simple. Like Sherwood, obviously his price per foot is different than possibly, Modesto. So the price per foot is kind of determined by the market and just regular comp search. Multifamily, you're seeing a lot of 250s, a lot of 280s a foot, 300 sometimes. Once you get into Beverly Hills and start over to the west side, you start seeing 5, 6, almost $1,000 a foot for duplexes and things like that. So this is mainly just a comp search. It's real simple, and you can get comfortable with it right away. If the market's $300 a foot and you're paying $400, you're overpaying for the property, or it's gold. So these are gut check numbers. This is really the beef of commercial property valuation, and it's called capitalization rate. You may have heard it tossed around a lot, but it goes by cap rate, and it's really this figure that really is all. What it really means is that, like I say here, it has a couple meanings, but what it really means is that what percentage of my capital is coming back every year that I invested in this thing. Or even easier is, what is my return annually on my capital? It kind of tells me what my rate of return is on it. And the reason why it's a great figure is because it's actually what the client cares about. It's how much money am I going to make on this thing? What's my return? I could put it into a CD and get X. Well, I could put it into here and get 6, that kind of a thing. And the way you do that, and that's why I said the net operating income figure, like we talked about above, is very relevant for valuation, because it's used in 2 ways. If you have a client that comes to you and says, the property, they're asking this for it, what's going to be my return? You can answer that. If they tell you, I'm looking to get 6 to 8% on my money, is that a good investment for me? You can answer that with this. And it's nonsense math. Is you take the net operating income, you divide it by the purchase price, and that tells you what return he's going to get on the property. He says, I found this property, it's $1 million, and I have X amount of net operating income on it that you find, then you're going to be getting about 9% return on this property. Great, so you call him back later. Or if he says, look, I'm looking for 8% return. I found this property, what do you think? You think I can get 8% on it? You take the net operating income, divide it by the rate that he wants, it tells you what he has to pay for it in order to get that. So it's very simple math, and this is the most relevant. When I come up with that value, though, I do a gut check with these two. So if this tells me I'm paying for an 8% return, my client's going to be happy. He could pay $1 million and get that return out of this property. Then I do that. If this is still in line, I do that. If that's still in line, we're good to go. If these are out of whack, I figure out why. If price per foot ends up being way out of whack, I figure, maybe this property was built last year, and maybe the upgrades are just so immense, it's worth it. Maybe this is the upswing. Arguments for it, but this is the flagship, and then I always consider these like little tugboats. Just kind of figuring out that, keeping it in line. Okay. When you get to I'm going to step back to the due diligence analysis where we talked about the questions, market vacancy, market rent, things to question about the market and all that stuff. The reason why that's so important to know a little bit about little pieces of that is that that's going to get you to what your net operating income is going to be. So if you find that the expenses are overcharged because insurance was double and you don't need to spend that much, or you could self-manage it and you don't need to pay a management fee, things that you could save, that obviously net operating income is going to go up because your expenses went down. It's going to increase the value of the property. So that's kind of generally how you look at the valuation of it. Very simple. It really applies to industrial and to retail all across the board. Just gets a little bit more complicated in that regard. That's why multifamily was more simple to analyze. That's about it on that. Any have any questions on that?
So if you have a building, for example, that generates a rent of $100,000 a year, and it has 40 in expenses. So you have a net. Let's say 5% vacant, and off that 40% expenses. So let's say at the end of the day you have 55 or so in cash. So the cap rate will be like a person that will want to buy it will say, I want to make 5.5%. So you would say this is worth about $1 million. This is how
Correct.
you would calculate.
Correct. So I don't have the math memorized. So if you take 55,000, what did you say he wanted for his return?
Let's say he wants 5.5. I just made it
So
for
if you
so
do,
the
he wants a
numbers.
5.5% return, you pay $1 million for the property.
Okay,
that's
so
what-
my next question is, how would you determine if an identical property is next door and the tenants that have been living there are rent control, have been paying a third of the rent that the tenants in the building next door pay? Does this mean that the building is worth a third?
So the building you're talking about, the tenants are paying about a third of what the,
There are two buildings that are identical. One of them has tenants that pay more, another one that pay less.
you have to analyze that. You have to
So-
say, well, maybe the comp next door is paying a third rent because maybe they're Section 8 tenants. Maybe they're government subsidized tenants that are in there versus the tenants that I have, which are just straight market tenants off the street. That's the analysis you have to do as part of the due diligence up front. That's what you need. Now, I'm not saying you need to do that, but I just wanted to, what this is about is just making you aware of those many issues that come up and why the due diligence of the property is very important to establishing, at the end of the day, what that mother is to figure out what it's worth. And that's what you do. So you're going to go next door and you're going to figure out, is it Section 8? You're going to call the leasing agent and say, is this Section 8 housing? Is that why the rent's a third? You're going to figure out what the market is.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Let's say, for example, there's an old lady that's been living there for 75 years and she pays $112, something ridiculous.
That's the dream.
So-
I mean,
so-
to have that, because if you're in a rent control neighborhood and you have these few people that are let's say you're looking at a 10-unit building and 3 of the units are stuck at $100 a month in rent control. We could talk about that separately, but there's certain ways you could fix that situation up, but that's a wait and see game, and literally you're waiting like an annuity, because rents could for that $100 unit could be $1,200. And that's part of the investment. It's part of the risk. You sit and you wait. And those are the dream. We've done that. I mean, that's the dream. It's you wait for the $500 to the $2,400 market rent kicker, and you just all of a sudden, created about $500,000 in value in your building by the wait. So that's why you would be interested in a building like that potentially.
Or you pay to move them.
Or you pay to move them, but there's restrictions on that too. So I know what you're saying. I'm not answering entirely, but it's about looking at the market, why that comp is doing that, or why your building is doing that, and it's reading the lease files, the tenant files. It's advising the client that you should grab the tenant files and read them. You should grab all the delinquency reports that you have on the property and read them, so that you know why the tenants are paying that.
So going back to the rent control question, why would you want to buy a building with rent control completely?
Well, I'm not afraid of rent control. Some people are afraid of it if you know how to deal with it. Depends on the age of the tenant. If you have a I hate to say that because it's really kind of nasty, but if you have a 10-unit building and they're all rent controlled, if a tenant leaves voluntarily or you have to kick the tenant out, you could boost it up to market. If a tenant unfortunately dies and you have to re-rent the property, you can now go to market. So sometimes you look at it, if you're willing to put up the risk, you look at a building that's 10 units and maybe there's half of them are not at market and they're all rent controlled. The half or 5 of them are rent controlled. Let's say they're half the rent. Let's say the market's $1,000 and they're renting for $500. So you have $2,500 of pent up rent that's not there yet. If I can get the building for the right number, I'll wait that out sometimes. It's a lot of risk because you're losing the money, but if you're buying it and you're still chunking a few changes in your pocket, waiting for the $2,500 a month kicker, that's what excites me, because you're going to see them. Every year you see one guy will move out and you'll be able to boost it up and you'll start seeing it.
So that's always the case? If someone's under rent control and they leave, then you can immediately go to market value?
Technically, it's really funny. In Los Angeles, every rent control district is different. In Los Angeles, the rent stabilization ordinance is still gray on whether a tenant voluntarily leaving, whether you can boost to fair market value. We always have. They say in verbally in their reports that if they leave voluntarily, you're supposed to keep it at the same rent, versus if you had to kick them out, which would be you can absolutely go to market. But it's not stated specifically anywhere. At least it wasn't 2 years ago, the last time I did a deal in Los Angeles.
I thought Santa Monica had always had to stay away.
Santa Monica is different. Santa Monica is a little bit, has a lot of different components at LA, and Burbank is a little different too, and I think they're getting rid of Burbank entirely, but yeah, Santa Monica is actually a little easier overall than LA even, for certain reasons.
Do you know of any rent control in the Canal Valley?
I don't.
I don't think we have it.
Senior restricted, Section 8.
Okay.
The only restrictions I really have seen around here, you know, and most of the senior stuff's in Thousand Oaks, off the mall, you know, that stuff up there. All right, just the last quick thing I wanted to say is how you get paid. Show me money for commercial leases versus commercial sales. And commercial leases, typically, the reason why sometimes I don't take a commercial referral is because it's just way too tiny and not worth anybody's time. So somebody will come and say, I have a tenant that needs 100 feet month to month. You know, it's one of those things you gotta allocate your time. But a regular standard commercial lease for office, retail, and whatnot, it's 2.5% to 3% of the gross rent for the term. So if you have a 5-year lease and they're paying, you know, $1,000 a month, it's what's that, $60,000 over the term, and you're going to be paid 2.5% to 3% on the term. That's the deal. Typically, typically, by the way, that excludes any free rent. So if there's any free rent offered up front and time to build out and stuff, that gets excluded. Typically what happens, and most agents don't know this, and sometimes people yell at me because I forget to tell them, but half of the commission gets paid at the time the lease is signed, the other half gets paid when the tenant actually occupies the space. So if put a tenant next door, a retail tenant, I could sign the lease, and 6 months later it may take them to get their permits, plans, approvals, build out, and open for business, a restaurant for instance. I'm getting my second half of commission after they actually open. So there is that timing involved in retail typically. If you have longer than a 5-year lease, most landlords will only pay you on 10 years. Okay, if you go over 10 years, then it's a real special negotiation, or they're real hard up for the tenant. But typically, they'll pay you for 10 years. And what happens is the first 5 years will be your straight 2.5% to 3%. The second 5 years, you're typically going to cut that in half because kind of the landlords start grinding you up a little bit. It's very standard. You can negotiate your way in or out of this all over the board. Some will just pay for 5 years, but this is kind of the standard. It's a possible 10-year limit. Most of the time, there's not a commission on any options to extend or purchase rights the tenant has. So if they have 2 5-year options to extend, you typically are not getting that. Sometimes you can negotiate in there. When they do, you'll get paid, but 10 years later, you might be hit by a bus. You never know. The one thing about office leases specifically, less than retail, I find that some of the office leases, especially with the larger companies like Arden, will pay kickers. Sometimes they'll pay up to 4%. So we had a deal where they paid 4% and then $2 a square foot as a bonus, which is nice. And they're not even hard up for space, So if it's a 5,000 square foot deal, at 4% at $2 a foot, you're talking some decent money. It could be $20,000, $25,000 commission plus a $2 a foot, $10,000 kicker. All of a sudden, it's a $30,000, $35,000 commission for a 5-year lease on a 5,000 foot tenant. So you might see some real sexy things like that. They're a bit out there, but they do happen. You can try to negotiate your way. When I submit an offer for a commercial lease, I always start at 3 to 4%, depending on what it is. Retail, typically 3. Office, I usually start at 4 and let them negotiate down. Commercial sales, typically the same thing as almost retail. It's 2.5% to 3% per side. Did I say gross rent during the lease term? I apologize, that's wrong. There's leases. So it's typically kind of like residential, very similar. Once it gets to a certain level of size, it typically starts becoming a fixed fee-based deal. I find that range starts to be at about the $10 million range. Once you get about $10 to $20 million, it starts becoming a $200,000 commission versus a 3% type commission, because the work is not commensurate with the size most of the time, so that gets negotiated down. So you might see that. And then referrals to me or to somebody else in the office, whatnot, fully negotiable for commercial. There's no fixed 25%. I've paid 5, I've paid 30. It's just all over the board. Standard is like kind of 20, depending. Don't panic, thanks for coming. Any questions, Manny?